Associate Director of International Market Access and Strategic Accounts in Myriad Genetics, and she's going to present to us the impact of gene signatures in oncology health costs, the UK experience from NICE. Ms. Harlow.
Mentioned my responsibilities for Myriad are around market access and reimbursement. Sorry. and I have had an opportunity to work in multiple health systems internationally, but the presentation today will be geared a little bit towards
Everything was fine, Mr. Kaplan. Thank you very much.
the experience with NICE in the UK. So NICE has a pretty well-defined process for determining whether or not a new technology is going to be approved and admitted into their guidance. They have multiple groups that are reviewing technologies. The one in particular that affects most of the technologies that Myriad has and other companies like ours is the Diagnostics Assessment Program. So essentially, this is a group that's evaluating tests with potential to improve health outcomes, but which also may have an increased cost to the health system. It's also looking at specific technologies that can measure the value based on clinical utility and cost effectiveness only. And if there are multiple technologies, this is the most sophisticated group within NICE that can do the evaluation, so they can make a comparative assessment even when the data doesn't directly compare those technologies in the literature. There also is a pretty robust cost-effectiveness analysis that's done at that time, which provides evidence around patient outcomes for the diagnostic technologies. In this space, really, you would find that the number of outcomes that are available and the quality of those outcomes for diagnostics is much less sophisticated than those for pharmaceuticals, which makes the health economic evaluation and cost-effectiveness analysis more complicated. In this context, we know that tests such as these are going to provide the most benefits to patients throughout the course of their treatment and as they move through the pathway of care. So it's quite important that we look at the whole pathway of care for a particular disease state that a technology or diagnostic test is going to influence. So in particular, NICE has a very well-defined pathway for these technologies, which is not the case across all other countries within Europe. There's lots of variation around the way diagnostics are assessed, but NICE in particular has a very well-defined 63-week process. There is still some variation on this 63-week process, but in essence, it covers things such as the scoping, what is going to be included in this diagnostics review, an overall assessment of the technology, if it's an individual technology or a group of technologies. It goes through a path where a draft recommendation is then made based on the work of the external assessment group. It's sent out for consultation, so there are opportunities for registered stakeholders within a particular group to provide comments and context around the assessment that's created. There is a path for resolutions, and then a final guidance is published, which then is connected to the reimbursement program through the NHS in England. So this is sort of a precursor to availability of funding for reimbursement through the NHS. The external assessment group is the one that will do the assessment. They're hired by NICE to do the data analysis. They will review all of the technologies data, both provided by the company and also what's out in the public domain. And this group was also the one that would be responsible for the health economics and cost effectiveness analysis. So they would have a group of health economists that would be reviewing this data and creating the work necessary to make those determinations. So because of the availability of data, models are used predominantly by the external assessment group during the assessment process. They're looking at things like costs, the outcomes that are derived through the care pathway, as well as the cost effectiveness. these are the tools that the committee, so the specialist committee that is assigned to review the technology, they'll use these outputs to make decisions about whether or not this is a technology that meets the criteria for movement through the NICE process and into the reimbursement pathway. And then registered stakeholders, including the manufacturers, including any clinicians and/or other relevant stakeholders like charities, patient advocacy groups, can have a look at the model to review. It is an executable model. However, there is some complexity, especially when there are multiple technologies that are being reviewed, where there's proprietary and confidential information that is redacted out of the models. So it does make it quite challenging for the manufacturer as well as the other registered stakeholders to input information into the model to see how it might change. So when considering what information they're going to use to develop these models, NICE has its own set of criteria. The external assessment group will also have their set of criteria that they will use. But in the US, there's a Center for Medical Technology, which also puts out sort of a phased approach to how to review the data that's available. This is sort of an opportunity to look at the different aspects of the test, how well the test performs, what is the validation, the generalizability, what are the components of that performance, as well as the health impacts, and then really what is the comparison with the standard of care. So in a technology assessment or diagnostics assessment, it is important to consider what are you comparing this to. So it's generally speaking not compared necessarily to another technology in a similar class. What you would see in this space more often is a comparison of how the diagnostic test performs as it compares to the standard of care. What is the current treatment practice in this pathway today in the absence of a diagnostic test? So this can provide a framework for development of that model. So there are costs and benefits that have to be looked at. The modeling needs to include all of the costs necessary to obtain the benefits and to assess whether or not there is harm to patients as a consequence of the diagnostic test. So they would look at things like the cost of the test itself, including anything that would require retesting if there are multiple avenues for which patients have to be tested. That would have to be considered. Are there any follow-up tests that have to be considered in that context? What are the treatments? What is the cost of that treatment? As well as what is the cost of any adverse effects from those treatments? And then potentially what is the cost of monitoring after treatment? And then they would look at this, as I mentioned earlier, as it is measured against the technology and the impact on the care pathway. So what are the outcomes for a particular technology, and how does that compare to the reference standard? So in the best case scenario, in a perfect world scenario, we have a randomized analysis which follows patients from diagnostic tests straight through to treatment for final outcomes. This is something that is rarely done in the context of review of technologies or diagnostic technologies. It's really expensive. It's a very lengthy process, and it is not necessarily realistic to provide that in the short term as you're looking for HTA bodies such as NICE to review the technology. There is a literature review then that can be done, where there would be a combined evidence approach, which leans back to the algorithm I showed you from the US just previously, which is aligned with this linked evidence approach. So in NICE, when they develop their models, as was mentioned earlier, their preferred method of measure is a QALY, so the health-related quality adjusted life years. And they're looking at the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or the ICER, between 20 and 35,000 pounds per QALY when they're evaluating whether or not the technology is going to be worthwhile. So just in terms of an example, we would have a breast cancer testing as an example. So this is the most recent test that Myriad has had run through the NICE process. This one ran alongside multiple other technologies in a similar space. There was an existing guidance in place already for the 3 years prior to this evaluation. But what was determined at the outset of this process was that, again, it would not be comparing one diagnostic test against the other, but rather all diagnostic tests in this particular space, this being gene expression testing for breast cancer, prognostic testing, would be compared against the standard of care. And so when they developed the analyses, they looked at what was the risk classification probability, what were the distant recurrence rates, what were the pre- and post-test chemotherapy usage, and what were the adjuvant chemotherapy treatment effects. And so this is a snapshot from the NICE guidance, which looks at the basis for which the external assessment group developed their models to review this technology. So in this context, there are a few drivers of the ICER, predominantly the risk stratification, what was the chemotherapy utilization post-test, was there or is there any chemotherapy benefit of the test that was being used, and that run alongside the test cost. So there was a particular data set that they used. In this context, there was one data set that compared 4 of the 5 technologies that were being reviewed, and so this was the basis for which they developed their models. So this is very similar in other cancer spaces. So gene expression testing for prostate cancer, which also looks at what would changes in the treatment paradigm be as a result of the test. In prostate cancer, we heard a lot about it in the previous presentation, patients who can be safely managed in active surveillance versus those patients who need to be treated definitively or who need multimodal therapies. And so if you look in the context of what this might mean for a group like NICE, we're looking at things like how do you increase active surveillance in patients with less aggressive tumors? What is the reduced progression rates in appropriately treated patients with more aggressive tumors? And overall, this is savings that's due to delayed or averted treatment. So it's quite similar to that of breast cancer, and the approach would be quite similar when looking at the cost effectiveness. So overall, I think looking at how gene signatures, gene expression testing, and oncology affect costs, it's quite a complex process. There's lots of variables that we're looking at. We heard a lot about multidisciplinary teams and where the costs are associated. Modeling is quite difficult to take into account all of the costs, but it is something that is an ongoing process. One of the best ways to work, at least from my perspective, representing a manufacturer, is to work with the country, work with a local government to develop real-world evidence and decision impact, because you can model against the literature, but what's most impactful for an individual HTA body in a particular country is how does this really impact the decisions that are made by clinicians? What is the real evidence that shows that this decision is going to impact cost in a favorable way while improving the outcomes for those patients over time? And we really need to develop this linked evidence, chain of evidence approach so that we can connect the two in a meaningful way and really get an opportunity to evaluate cost effectiveness of technologies like these that can benefit patients, improve outcomes over time without needing the lengthy analysis and costly and timely analysis that is potentially comparative to what's done currently for pharmaceuticals. So just in summary from my perspective, companies like Myriad and others that work in this space, we generally have a commitment to reduce costs while simultaneously improving patient care, quality care. Technologies like molecular diagnostic tests are designed to help healthcare providers really make more precise decisions, to allow for more effective treatments, more appropriate screenings, and really a timely and ultimately improved patient outcome. This is a collaborative effort. It really has to be alongside clinicians, manufacturers, those that are really adept at evaluating the cost effectiveness and looking at all of the relevant costs that are associated. We know for a fact that precision medicine will lead to overall cost savings, but when we try to model that, we need to consider all of the silos that exist and every single cost center that might be impacted by a particular diagnostic test if you're really going to get the ultimate goal of reducing the upfront spend, eliminating the unnecessary therapies and related comorbidities, and providing those clinical improvements. this is a collaborative effort, and I hope in my role and in future roles that we'll have an opportunity to see the health system and all the relevant stakeholders collaborate to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Hanlon. I think we have time for one question, if any. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.